It started with a look, the kind that lasts less than a second but says everything. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, wearing nothing but a black coat and quiet urgency, handed over her boarding pass like any other traveler. But to the young man behind the counter, she wasn't anyone. She was a problem. Within minutes, TSA officers were circling. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't resisted. Still, they told her to step aside. And then, they dragged her out of line, past silent passengers and blinking gate screens, as if her very presence required containment. But what no one at that terminal expected was what happened next. When a calm, soft-spoken man walked through the doors, everything shifted. He didn't flash a badge. He didn't shout. He just asked one question and made everyone else stop talking. This story is dramatized. Names, moments, and outcomes are fictionalized to illuminate a deeper truth. Because while this may not have happened exactly as told, for far too many, it already has. LaGuardia Airport, 5:42 a.m. There was something different about the air before sunrise, like the world hadn't quite made up its mind yet. LaGuardia was quiet but not still. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a pale blue tint that made even the cleanest tiles look tired. A janitor pushed his cart past gate 22B, wheels squeaking with every step. Somewhere overhead, a voice on the intercom read off delayed flights like confessions. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked briskly through Terminal C, shoulders squared, face bare, eyes focused. She wore a long black coat over a gray turtleneck. No makeup, no entourage. In one hand, a boarding pass lit by the glow of her phone screen. In the other, a crumpled tissue, faintly stained from mascara she didn't realize she'd cried off during the Uber ride from Queens. She wasn't here to campaign. She wasn't here to speak. She wasn't even supposed to be seen. Her aunt, the one who raised her when her mother worked 2 jobs, had passed away the night before. Pneumonia. No press statement, no schedule change. Just grief. Quiet, inconvenient, and unforgiving. And now she was heading to San Juan for the funeral, alone, on a flight booked 4 hours earlier, between back-to-back committee briefs and a voicemail she still hadn't played. As she walked past the food court, shuttered, dark, and smelling faintly of old fryer oil, she instinctively scanned the crowd. Habit. Even when she wasn't working, she was watching. Everyone around her moved with that same early morning detachment. Earbuds in, eyes low, heart somewhere else. But one man did look up. He sat behind the American Airlines check-in desk. Young, clean cut. Something in his smirk landed wrong, like he knew something she didn't, or decided something she didn't deserve. His eyes dropped back to the screen as she approached, but the chill lingered. AOC took a breath and stepped forward. "Hi, I'm on flight 826 to San Juan. I'd like to check this through." He didn't smile, didn't greet, just nodded and reached for her ID without a word. She handed it over. He glanced down. Then something flickered, not confusion, recognition, and something else, like amusement. "Huh, you're not in the system." The sentence was too casual, too fast. No double check, no apology. "I checked in an hour ago," she said, keeping her voice even. "Here, boarding pass." She held up the screen. He didn't look, just waved someone else over. A second agent appeared, older, with the kind of dead-eyed stare only shift work can teach. "Random screening," she said flatly. "We need to verify credentials." "That's not protocol," AOC said, her tone calm but unyielding. "I've flown this route 3 times in the last 2 months. That doesn't happen." The younger agent leaned back in his chair, arms folded, expression unreadable now. "Ma'am, if you could just step to the side." No explanation, no effort, just a command, sugar-coated in fake courtesy. She looked down at her phone. 6:06 a.m. Boarding began in 25 minutes. Still, she stepped aside. Not because she agreed, because she understood exactly what this might turn into. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a question began tapping. Is this about who I am or what I am? She wouldn't know the answer yet, but the way the hallway behind the desk suddenly seemed darker. She could feel something coming, something cold, something familiar, and something that would make this morning anything but quiet. The man behind the desk looked up just long enough to decide something about her. It wasn't overt. It wasn't loud. But AOC had seen that look before, in briefings, in back rooms, in places where power dressed itself in politeness and called it protocol. The glance lasted less than a breath, but it said everything. You're going to be a problem. His name tag read Ryan, though he didn't offer it. He didn't greet her. Just motioned toward the counter with a chin lift like she was ordering coffee, not checking in for a government-sanctioned flight. She unlocked her phone and pulled up her boarding pass. Flight 826 to San Juan, she said, voice even. I'm already checked in. Just need to tag my bag. Ryan took the phone without a word. The glow from the screen lit his face for a moment, then disappeared as he looked down. He tapped once, then again, then leaned slightly back in his chair. There it was, a half smirk, the corner of his mouth twitching upward, like he'd found something amusing. You're not in the system. AOC blinked. Excuse me? Your name's not pulling up, he said. Could be a back-end issue, or maybe it didn't finish processing. I got my check-in confirmation at 3:12 a.m. Same app I always use, she said, holding the screen up again. It's right here. He didn't bother to look. Instead, he hit a button beneath the desk and waved over another employee, an older woman with the energy of someone who'd long stopped caring how things looked. They leaned in toward the monitor, whispered just loud enough for AOC to hear her own name, and nodded like something had just been confirmed. Neither asked her a question. Neither acknowledged her presence beyond glances. Ryan leaned forward again and handed back her phone. You've been selected for a random screening. She narrowed her eyes. Selected? Based on what? It's standard procedure. No, it's not. I've flown this route multiple times. I've never been flagged. Ryan shrugged, but it wasn't the kind that apologized. It was the kind that ended conversations. It happens. AOC pulled out her congressional ID, calm but unmistakably firm. This is official travel. If there's a legitimate concern, I'll cooperate. But I'm asking you now, is there something you're not telling me? He barely glanced at the ID. You'll need to speak with TSA. It wasn't the words that made her chest tighten. It was the way he said them. Like this wasn't about a boarding pass or a glitch. Like the decision had already been made, and she was just catching up. The second employee nodded toward a rope divider near the side hallway. Please stand over there, she said. No eye contact, no explanation. Passengers behind her began to murmur. She could feel their phones lift subtly, like a shift in wind direction. Someone whispered, Isn't that AOC? Ryan's jaw twitched. His eyes darted toward the crowd, then back to his screen. She wasn't sure what bothered him more, that people were noticing, or that she hadn't raised her voice. But she didn't move to escalate. She just stepped aside slowly, her hand still on the handle of her carry-on, her shoulders square. Something wasn't right, and they all knew it. AOC reached calmly into her coat pocket and pulled out her official ID. The badge, small but unmistakable, caught the fluorescent light as she held it up. Steady, deliberate. Congressional identification, she said. This is official travel. I'm heading to a memorial service for my aunt in San Juan. If you need additional documentation, I can provide that too. The second employee, the woman who had muttered her name earlier, took the ID with one hand and a breath with the other. But it was the kind of breath people take when they're about to pretend they don't see what's in front of them. She glanced at the card briefly, lips tightening. Then, without returning it, she turned to Ryan and said flatly, Let's get TSA. Alexandria's voice didn't rise, but the edge in it sharpened. I just presented a valid ID. I've passed through this terminal before, on similar trips. Why is TSA being involved? It's protocol, the woman said, already motioning toward a nearby phone. Protocol for what? AOC pressed. You're flagging me for random screening, overriding my credentials, and now summoning federal officers. What part of that is standard? Neither of them answered. Ryan typed something into the keyboard, eyes flickering across the screen like he was watching the minutes until his shift ended. The woman placed the ID down on the desk, not back into AOC's hand, but away from her, as if it no longer belonged to her at all. AOC stood still, not stiff, not frozen, just still, the way someone does when they've learned that too much movement will be read as aggression, and too little will be mistaken for compliance. She scanned their faces again. Nothing. No embarrassment. No urgency. Just the calm, quiet cruelty of people hiding behind process. It took less than 90 seconds for two TSA officers to appear. They didn't run. They didn't walk slowly either. It was that unnerving middle pace, measured and mechanical, like they'd already rehearsed this moment. The taller of the two, a man in his 40s with a thick jaw and thinning hair, approached first. "Ma'am," he said, "we're going to need you to come with us." "For what reason?" AOC asked, not moving. "Random screening," he replied. His voice was flat, practiced. "You've been flagged." She didn't flinch. "I've complied with every request. I presented my ID. I've made no scene. I'm carrying no prohibited items. Is there a specific reason I've been targeted?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, who shrugged like he didn't care one way or the other. "We're just responding to the call." AOC looked down at the desk, at her ID still resting there, like it no longer mattered. "Of course you are," she murmured. She picked up her bag. The screen behind the desk still showed her flight. 8:26 to San Juan. Boarding in 23 minutes. This wasn't a system glitch. This wasn't a missing reservation or mistyped name. It wasn't random. This was a decision. And now it had momentum. The officer didn't grab her arm. He didn't raise his voice. He simply gestured toward a hallway near gate 22B, the way someone might direct a tour group toward the exit. But the weight behind the gesture said everything. Follow, without question, without noise, and especially without resistance. AOC nodded once and began walking. Her steps were steady, deliberate, not slow enough to seem defiant, not fast enough to seem afraid, just enough to let people notice. And they did. Across the terminal, heads turned in quiet waves, some subtle, others sharp. A woman holding a stroller looked up and blinked twice. A man in business casual paused mid-text, phone still glowing in his palm. At first, no one said anything, but then came the whisper, just loud enough to carry. "Wait, isn't that AOC?" The words hung in the air like a dropped coin in a cathedral. From behind, a teenager in a hoodie raised his phone, camera already rolling. Another tapped her partner on the arm. "Is she being arrested?" they mouthed, though no one answered. Everyone was watching, but no one moved. The TSA officers flanked AOC like bookends, symmetrical, impersonal, practiced. One walked slightly ahead, the other slightly behind, giving the illusion of space while signaling unmistakable control. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. The visual did the work. AOC kept her eyes forward. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, but she didn't show it. Her grip on the carry-on handle stayed firm, knuckles pale but still. She passed a row of monitors showing weather delays and connecting flights. Her face reflected briefly in the glass. Unflinching, unreadable. As they turned down the side corridor, the lights dimmed slightly. The hum of the crowd faded. Even the intercom announcements seemed to quiet, like the building itself was holding its breath. The hallway was lined with beige walls, scuffed linoleum, and the kind of silence that comes after a verdict has already been made. Behind them, a security camera blinked red. She caught it in her peripheral vision and let it see her. Not her outrage, not her fear, her presence. The taller officer cleared his throat. "It'll just be a quick review, ma'am." She didn't respond, not because she couldn't, because she knew what he meant by quick, and because nothing she said right now would be recorded as clarity, only as tone. Halfway down the corridor, she heard the shutter click of a phone camera from the gate behind. Someone had captured the moment. She didn't know who. That didn't matter. What mattered was that it had been seen. She passed a closed office door, a flickering overhead light, a utility closet that hadn't been fully shut. Everything looked temporary, like it had been built for containment, not care. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and recycled air. AOC exhaled once quietly through her nose. She was not being arrested. She was not being warned. She was being moved. So they could say later she'd been handled. And just like that, the line between protective protocol and public humiliation became impossible to ignore. The room was colder than the hallway, not by temperature, but by design. No windows, no chairs, just white walls, a metal table, a mounted camera in the corner, and a stale fluorescent light that made everything look like evidence. The kind of space meant to make you feel small before anyone ever says a word. AOC stepped in without protest. She placed her bag on the table, unzipped it halfway, then stepped back. One officer took position behind the table, the other beside her. Neither introduced themselves. "We'll begin with a physical inspection," the taller one said. "Please raise your arms." She did, slowly, calmly. She kept her gaze level, her breath even. Her fingers didn't tremble. Not because she wasn't angry, but because she knew anger would be misinterpreted, filed under non-compliance, folded into a report, and she had no intention of being reduced to a footnote in someone else's narrative. Gloved hands began to trace the outline of her arms, shoulders, sides. Quick, impersonal movements, mechanical yet intentional. When they reached her waist, the officer paused briefly, then continued. Nothing about the procedure was violent, but everything about it was invasive. Her belongings were next. The younger officer began pulling items from her bag. A notebook, flipped open, pages skimmed. A phone charger, unwound, stretched, inspected. Her toiletry pouch, unzipped and emptied onto the table in a line, as if being inventoried for guilt. They didn't ask her permission. They didn't explain the process. They simply moved as though the authority to do so was woven into their sleeves. "I'd like to know the basis for this inspection," AOC said, her voice steady but unmistakably firm. "Is there a reported threat? A security flag? Something beyond random?" The officer didn't look up. "We're following orders." "What orders?" she asked. "Screening protocol," he replied. "I'm a member of Congress on official travel. You've seen my ID. You verified my documents. This isn't random. This is targeted." That caught a pause, but only for a second. The officer glanced at his partner. No words exchanged, just a look. Then he returned to rifling through her laptop sleeve. Her hand twitched slightly at her side. Not from fear, from restraint. She wanted to demand answers. She wanted to remind them of the laws they were skating too close to violating. But she knew better. Right now, her composure was not just her armor. It was her evidence. The taller officer moved toward the wall-mounted console and typed something into a keypad. AOC's screen lit up with her boarding information. Flight 826 to San Juan, still marked as on time. Boarding likely in progress. "I've already missed my flight, haven't I?" she asked softly. No one answered. They finished the inspection 15 minutes later. Her belongings were returned. Not folded, not arranged, just pushed back across the table like clutter. Her ID lay beneath her hairbrush. Her documents were bent. She repacked her bag in silence. They didn't stop her, but they didn't apologize either. The officer pulled out a clipboard. "You're clear," he said. "You can proceed." "To where?" she asked. "The flight's gone." He didn't reply, just turned to open the door. She zipped her bag slowly, carefully, and walked past them with the kind of grace that made their silence louder. This wasn't about safety, and it hadn't been for some time. The door clicked shut behind her, not loudly but definitively, like a sentence being completed without appeal. AOC stood for a moment, adjusting the strap of her bag, unsure if she should wait for someone to escort her back to the terminal, or if she was supposed to navigate it alone, like someone being quietly released from custody. No one said anything. No one looked at her. The TSA officers had already shifted their postures, turned away slightly, bodies angled toward the hallway as if she were no longer part of the script. A spent scene, a complication wrapped and filed away. She stepped into the corridor by herself. It was emptier now, quieter somehow than before, not by sound, but by presence. Her footsteps echoed slightly on the linoleum. The gate monitors were still flickering in the distance. She looked up. Flight 826 departed. No final call, no gate closing, just gone. A plane in the sky, a promise lost. AOC walked to a cold metal bench near the wall and sat down slowly. She didn't drop her bag, didn't exhale sharply. She placed her hands on her knees and stared ahead. Not at anything, just through it. Her shoulders were still squared, her jaw set. But inside, something heavy had shifted. She had missed the funeral. She had missed her aunt's service. She had missed the soft voice of her cousin on the phone that morning asking, "You'll speak, right? Just a few words?" She had missed the moment. Not because she was late, not because she failed to prepare, but because someone decided she should be doubted, because someone smirked when they saw her name, because someone thought Congresswoman wasn't enough to earn decency. And now, she sat, not in grief, not yet. She was still too angry for grief. This wasn't heartbreak. It was erosion. Slow, methodical, familiar. Across from her, the TSA officer who had performed the search leaned against the wall, arms folded, gaze fixed somewhere above her head. Avoidance as policy. The other had stepped outside to take a call, muttering something into a government-issued phone as if talking logistic could drown out what just happened. AOC opened her phone. Her screen was filled with missed messages, a text from her mother. "Did you land yet? They're starting soon?" Another from her chief of staff. "You okay? You didn't board." She didn't reply to either. Instead, she tapped out a new message. No context, no punctuation, no overthinking, just 3 words. "I need you." She hit send. The message wasn't about crisis. It wasn't a rescue flare. It was the moment when composure had done its job, and now something else was needed. Presence. Witness. Someone who wouldn't ask questions, but would understand the answers that hadn't been spoken. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to rest, to brace, because the worst part wasn't what had already happened. It was what would come next. The apologies laced with denial, the forms that led nowhere, the internal reviews that didn't review anything at all. And beneath all of it, the truth no one would say aloud. They never thought anyone would care that she sat alone. The automatic doors at Terminal C slid open, letting in a fresh pulse of morning air. Robert Salazar stepped inside with quiet confidence. He wore a well-worn gray coat over a neatly pressed shirt, his eyes sharp and calm beneath the brim of a simple cap. He moved with the kind of measured steps that spoke of decades spent navigating halls of power, not with noise or fury, but with quiet authority. The terminal's hum shifted imperceptibly as he walked. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Phones stopped recording mid-tap. The charged air thickened, not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't need to. Presence had a language of its own. Robert's gaze swept over the scene before settling on the check-in desk. The younger agent, Ryan, noticed the shift immediately. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. The second agent stiffened. The TSA officers glanced toward the new arrival, their practiced nonchalance replaced by guarded alertness. Robert paused a few feet away, his posture straight but relaxed. He scanned the room, taking in every detail, the scattered belongings on the table, the folded papers, the tired faces pretending not to watch. Then in a voice low but commanding, he spoke. "Who's in charge here?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, though his tone carried no accusation, only expectation. A silence stretched longer than comfortable. The gate manager emerged from the shadows, clipboard in hand, hesitation writ across his face. I'm the supervisor," the man stammered. Robert nodded once. "Good. I need to understand exactly what happened here, and I need the name of the person who decided to involve security over a boarding pass." The supervisor swallowed hard, eyes flickering to Ryan, who avoided the gaze. "Sir, Robert interrupted, stepping just close enough to close the gap. "I'm not interested in excuses. I'm interested in accountability." He turned slightly, locking eyes with Ryan. "You understand, don't you? Detaining a sitting member of Congress without cause is not just a procedural error. It's a legal violation." Ryan swallowed, a bead of sweat gathering at his temple. He looked around as if searching for an escape hatch, but found none. Robert's voice dropped to an even quieter but more dangerous level. "This isn't about who she is. It's about what you did, and I intend to see that it's addressed." The energy in the room shifted again, this time heavier, palpable, like the weight of a verdict about to be passed. People watching from nearby gates stopped whispering. Phones were lowered. Even the hum of the terminal seemed to pause, as if the building itself was holding its breath. AOC watched from where she sat, arms crossed lightly, her eyes sharp and unblinking. She didn't have to say a word. Robert's calm fury was enough. The agent who had set this in motion glanced down at the floor, his shoulders tightening as the spotlight found him uncomfortably bright. In that moment, power was not shouted or brandished. It was measured, quiet, and impossible to ignore. The supervisor cleared his throat, but his voice wavered as Robert's piercing gaze held him in place. We didn't know who she was, he stammered, glancing toward Ryan for support. But the younger agent remained silent, his face pale. Robert didn't flinch. You didn't know? Or you didn't care? The room's air thickened, the weight of the question pressing down on everyone present. The gate agent swallowed hard, fingers twitching at the keyboard as if typing might erase the uncomfortable truth. You detained a sitting member of Congress, Robert continued evenly, without probable cause, without legal justification. You ignored her government ID. You subjected her to unnecessary humiliation. Do you understand the seriousness of these actions? Ryan shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Robert's voice sharpened. Detaining a federal official is not a mistake. It is a violation of federal law. Racial profiling, assuming someone is suspicious because of how they look or where they come from, is illegal and unconscionable. The supervisor opened his mouth to reply but closed it again. His eyes flicked to the nearby cameras, now silently recording every second. We were following protocol, he finally muttered, voice thin. Security procedures. Protocol does not give you license to strip dignity away, Robert interrupted. You followed orders without question. But orders are not laws and they are not excuses. A tense silence filled the space. Nearby passengers who had gathered behind the rope barrier shifted uneasily. Some pulled out phones, fingers trembling as they typed. Robert stepped closer to Ryan, lowering his voice to a quiet but firm tone that somehow filled the room. You do realize this is targeted escalation? That security was called not because of an actual threat, but because someone decided she was a problem? Ryan swallowed hard, his jaw clenched. AOC's eyes narrowed slightly from where she stood, arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable, but the quiet fire behind it burned hotter with every word. The supervisor rubbed his neck, clearly scrambling for an answer. We had no intention to discriminate. This was a misunderstanding. Robert's gaze hardened. Mistakes are made every day, but ignoring who someone is, refusing to acknowledge their position and identity, is not a misunderstanding. It is prejudice, and you need to own that. The tension grew palpable. Staff whispered among themselves, some casting sidelong glances at the law professor who had just laid bare their failings. Robert took a deep breath. I will be demanding a full internal review, and I expect accountability, not just promises. The gate manager nodded quickly, already pulling out his phone to call his regional supervisor. The young agents remained silent, now shadows under the spotlight. Robert turned to AOC, who gave a subtle nod. They were far from finished. The atmosphere in the terminal had shifted irreversibly. What moments ago had been casual indifference and quiet dismissal now felt like a spotlight under which every action, every decision was suddenly exposed in stark relief. Robert Salazar stood tall and unyielding, his gaze locked not just on the gate agents before him, but on the system they represented, one that had allowed this moment to happen. You shouldn't have to know someone to treat them with dignity, Robert said, his voice low but clear enough for everyone within earshot. It was not a question. It was a command, a truth spoken without apology or equivocation. The gate agent, Ryan, who had first smirked at AOC's boarding pass and then called security, shifted uncomfortably under Robert's scrutiny. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a pale tension that was impossible to mask. His eyes darted around the crowd gathering near the gate, sensing the weight of judgment settling on him like an unseen shroud. AOC watched silently from a short distance away, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, her posture relaxed but firm, like a sentinel holding ground in a storm. She no longer felt the need to defend or explain. Her role had shifted from participant to observer, bearing witness to the consequences of a system that had failed her. Robert's gaze bore into Ryan, the very embodiment of institutional arrogance and complacency. The decision to escalate without cause, to dismiss a verified official with a simple smirk, crosses a line that should never have been drawn. It undermines trust, it damages lives, and it erodes the very values that are supposed to guide us. A hush fell over the onlookers. Phones continued to record, capturing every syllable, every gesture, every silent tension that filled the space. The terminal, usually a place of movement and noise, seemed to hold its breath. Ryan swallowed hard, swallowing the lump of regret rising in his throat. The man who had confidently waved off AOC's concerns now stood exposed, his smirk replaced by a tight-lipped silence. Without a word, he turned and disappeared down the terminal hallway, retreating from the scene that had unraveled before him. Robert didn't pursue him. Instead, he turned back to the supervisor, who stood awkwardly clutching his clipboard. This is bigger than one employee's mistake. It's about the culture that allows such disregard to persist. It's about accountability, transparency, and respect. The supervisor nodded, struggling to maintain composure. "We will conduct a full investigation," he promised. "We take these concerns seriously." But Robert wasn't finished. An investigation isn't enough. Apologies aren't enough. This moment, this injustice, has to serve as a catalyst for real change. Otherwise, it's just another story buried under bureaucracy. AOC stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's ever been made to feel invisible, dismissed because of how they look, where they come from, or who they love. It's about the dignity we all deserve, whether we have a title or not." Her words rippled through the crowd, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement. People who had only watched now felt seen, connected to a shared experience of marginalization and resilience. Robert looked at her, pride shining quietly behind his steady gaze. "You stood your ground without raising your voice," he said softly. "Sometimes that's the loudest statement you can make." Together, they turned away from the desk. The crowd parted respectfully, sensing that the confrontation had ended, but the reckoning had just begun. Behind them, the terminal resumed its usual rhythm, but something lingered in the air, a reminder that power is not always loud, and that dignity is a right, not a privilege. The agent who had triggered it all remained out of sight, swallowed by the winding corridors of the airport, his presence now a shadow cast by the weight of his own actions. The gate manager's footsteps echoed sharply against the terminal floor as he approached, clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. His face was a mask of forced professionalism, a practiced smile stretched thin over mounting discomfort. Behind him, a regional supervisor trailed, her expression taut, eyes scanning the growing crowd that had gathered like moths drawn to an unspoken blaze. "AOC," the gate manager began, voice pitched just above the ambient hum of the airport. "We deeply regret the inconvenience you've experienced today. This is not the standard of service we aim to provide." His words fell flat in the space between them, weighed down by the murmurs of onlookers and the heavy silence that followed. He extended a glossy, embossed voucher toward her. "To make amends, we'd like to offer you a first-class seat on the next available flight, along with a travel voucher for your troubles." AOC looked down at the voucher, then back up at the faces around her, some expectant, others skeptical. Her fingers curled loosely around the strap of her carry-on. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I'm not here for compensation." There was a slight ripple in the crowd, an audible shift as her words landed with the weight of truth. "I'm here for accountability," she continued, her voice steady and clear, reverberating enough to catch even the most distracted ears. "For the dignity that was stripped away, not just from me, but from everyone who's ever been made to feel invisible at a place they have every right to be." The gate manager blinked, momentarily thrown off by her refusal. "We understand your frustration. Our intention is to resolve this amicably." "Intention isn't enough," AOC said, shaking her head, "because intentions don't fix the fact that security was called without cause, that my credentials were ignored, that I missed a funeral because someone decided I was a problem." The regional supervisor stepped forward, voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of impatience. "We're conducting a full internal review. You'll be kept informed of the outcomes." AOC's eyes locked onto hers. That review should have started the moment I was pulled aside. Please understand, the supervisor interjected quickly. This is a complex process. We take all concerns seriously. But seriousness requires action, AOC replied, her tone unyielding. Apologies without consequences are just words, and words don't bring back the moments stolen from me or from others. Around her, whispers grew louder. Phones continued recording, the story unfolding in real time. A young woman whispered to her companion, I can't believe they thought they could just sweep this under the rug. An elderly man nearby shook his head slowly, muttering, This happens to folks like us all the time. Never gets fixed. The gate manager swallowed, visibly frustrated but constrained by the optics of the moment. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, if there's anything more we can do to, don't offer me more. Offer me justice. Her words, simple but sharp, echoed across the terminal. The crowd stilled, eyes now fully on the exchange. AOC turned away from the gate staff and walked toward a bench nearby. She sat down, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Robert Salazar joined her, his expression calm but fierce. You handled that well, he said quietly. I had to, she replied, because this isn't about me. It's about every person who's been told their story doesn't matter. Robert nodded. Accountability will come. The question is whether they'll listen or just wait for us to go away. AOC looked back at the gate, where the staff were already resuming their duties, eyes darting nervously. They can try to move on, but the cameras are still rolling. The world is still watching. Her phone buzzed. A message from her chief of staff. The footage is everywhere. Calls are coming in. She typed back simply, keep pushing. Because this moment, though painful, was only the beginning. Robert Salazar was not one to back down easily. When the airport manager, a middle-aged man with a wrinkled shirt and evasive eyes, stated that he could not disclose the name of the staff member who called security due to personnel privacy, Robert fixed him with a steady gaze, not just with his eyes, but with the weight of a seasoned lawyer ready for battle. Personnel privacy, Robert repeated calmly but firmly. So you believe discrimination is also personnel privacy, or is it simply a cover-up? The manager looked flustered, glancing around as if seeking invisible support from nearby colleagues. We have to protect our staff's privacy, he said, trying to stay composed. I must remind you this is an internal process, and internal processes don't grant you license to break the law, Robert interrupted. And in this case, you allowed an employee under your supervision to turn discrimination into a public spectacle, an act that violated a federal official's rights and tarnished her dignity. Ryan, the gate agent who had triggered the incident, shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Robert's voice sharpened. Detaining a sitting member of Congress without probable cause, ignoring her government ID, subjecting her to unnecessary humiliation. Do you understand how serious this is? Ryan looked down, jaw clenched tight. The manager opened his mouth to reply but closed it again, his eyes flickering to the surveillance cameras now silently recording every moment. We were following protocol, he finally muttered, voice thin. Security procedures. Protocol doesn't give you permission to strip away dignity, Robert said firmly. You followed orders without question. But orders aren't laws and they aren't excuses. A heavy silence filled the room. Passengers behind the rope barrier shifted uneasily, some pulling out phones to record. Robert stepped closer to Ryan, lowering his voice to a quiet but piercing tone that seemed to fill the entire space. Do you realize this was targeted escalation? Security was called not because of an actual threat, but because someone decided she was a problem. Ryan swallowed hard. His jaw tightened. AOC's eyes narrowed slightly from her position. Arms crossed, the quiet fire behind them growing hotter with every word. The manager rubbed his neck, clearly scrambling. We had no intention to discriminate. This was a misunderstanding. Robert's gaze hardened. Mistakes happen every day, but ignoring who someone is, refusing to acknowledge their position and identity, is not a misunderstanding. It is prejudice, and you must own that. Tension thickened. Staff whispered nervously, exchanging sidelong glances at the law professor who had just exposed their failures. Robert took a deep breath. I will demand a full internal review, and I expect accountability, not just empty promises." The gate manager nodded quickly, already pulling out his phone to call his regional supervisor. The young agent stood silent, now shadows beneath the spotlight. Robert turned to AOC, who gave a subtle nod. They were far from done. A small crowd had gathered quietly near the rope barrier, drawn not by spectacle but by a shared recognition, an unspoken understanding that what had just unfolded wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom. Phones were out, cameras focused, recording not just AOC, but the charged atmosphere in the terminal. People whispered to each other, voices low but urgent. The terminal lights, once indifferent, seemed to pulse with the collective heartbeat of those watching. A middle-aged woman, her hair streaked with silver, leaned toward her husband and whispered, "That happened to my dad at O'Hare last year. He missed his surgery because of it." The man nodded grimly. "They called him difficult just for asking why his boarding pass wasn't working." A young nurse standing nearby, scrubs still visible beneath her jacket, glanced at the screen of her phone. "I was held back last month. They said it was random screening, but I knew better." AOC, standing a few feet away beside Robert, caught snatches of the conversation without needing to turn her head. The weight of these shared stories pressed on her. The collective grief and frustration of those who had been overlooked, dismissed, or outright humiliated. Her face remained calm, her posture composed, but beneath that exterior was a fire smoldering with quiet intensity. This was bigger than a missed flight or delayed trip. It was about dignity, respect, and the simple right to exist without suspicion. A teenager nearby, phone camera still recording, whispered to a friend, "She didn't yell. She didn't fight." And that made it worse for them. The friend nodded slowly. "Because when you don't scream, they try to erase you." Robert glanced at AOC, their eyes meeting in a moment that needed no words. They understood that this moment, charged with pain, anger, and hope, was not theirs alone to carry. It belonged to all those who had ever been made to feel invisible. The supervisor who had earlier offered compensation lingered near the edge of the group, watching nervously as the crowd grew. The stories multiplied, and the silent solidarity became harder to ignore. "Is she going to be okay?" someone asked quietly. "She's stronger than they know," another voice replied. "But it's exhausting. It wears you down." AOC's gaze swept over the gathered faces, their phones, their whispered stories. She saw in them the faces of mothers, veterans, teachers, workers, people whose stories rarely made headlines but whose lives were marked by the same injustice. After a final nod to Robert, she stepped forward, moving with quiet determination. Cameras followed, phones recorded. The crowd parted respectfully, sensing the weight of the moment. Without looking back, AOC and Robert walked away from the gate area, leaving behind the whispered stories and the lingering tension like a silent promise that this would not be forgotten. Their steps echoed down the terminal, steady and resolute. It wasn't just about her, it was about all of them. Because sometimes standing still is the loudest statement you can make. Within minutes of the confrontation unfolding in the terminal, the first grainy video appeared online. A shaky phone camera had captured the moment AOC was led away, composed but undeniably constrained. The silence around her louder than any shout. It was raw, it was unfiltered, and it was impossible to ignore. The video spread like wildfire. On Twitter, hashtags began to form. Hashtag Gate28Justice, hashtag She Didn't Raise Her Voice, each tweet carrying fragments of disbelief, outrage, and solidarity. People from every corner of the country began sharing their versions of what they saw, layering their own stories beneath the clip as if to say, "You're not alone." The trend snowballed. News feeds overflowed with retweets and reactions. Celebrities and activists lent their voices, turning a quiet incident into a loud call for change. The hashtags crossed borders and demographics, drawing attention far beyond the gates of LaGuardia. In homes and offices, viewers watched, some with tears, some with clenched fists. Conversations sparked at dinner tables and water coolers. The video wasn't just footage. It was a mirror reflecting countless faces who had been pushed aside, dismissed, or silenced. News outlets seized the moment. Major networks broke the story, framing it as a clear-cut example of systemic injustice in the heart of everyday America. Headlines screamed, "Congresswoman blocked at airport, a story of dignity denied." Viral video exposes racial profiling at major airport. AOC's silent stand sparks national debate on travel rights. Journalists reached out for statements. Interviews were scheduled. Press releases drafted. Yet AOC chose restraint. She declined immediate media appearances, preferring instead to let the video speak for itself and to focus on crafting a response that demanded more than fleeting attention. Social media became a battleground. Supporters and critics flooded platforms, debates ignited, and petitions started circulating calling for policy changes in airport security procedures. The online uproar forced the airline and TSA to respond, first with a terse statement expressing regret and promising internal review, but without naming names or admitting fault. But the momentum had shifted. The story was no longer just about a congresswoman. It was about every traveler who had ever felt invisible, every voice muffled by bureaucratic indifference. The video comments section blossomed with thousands of testimonies. A school teacher recounted how she was once detained for looking suspicious when picking up her daughter from a different city. A nurse shared how she missed a critical shift after being held up at security for hours without explanation. An elderly veteran described the humiliation of being questioned repeatedly, despite clear documentation. These stories build upon each other, forming a collective narrative of frustration and resilience. They galvanized communities, ignited calls for accountability, and underscored a harsh truth. Dignity is not a privilege reserved for the few, but a right owed to all. In the midst of the digital storm, AOC drafted an op-ed titled, "Dignity Isn't a Reward, It's a Right." In it, she wrote of the morning she was flagged not for what she did, but for who she was, about the cold efficiency of a system designed to protect, yet too often used to exclude. She spoke directly to those whose stories were now intertwined with hers, urging a reckoning not just for one incident, but for the pervasive culture it represented. As the op-ed was published in several major newspapers, its key line echoed widely. "Don't offer me courtesy, offer me consistency." That line crystallized the growing movement's core demand. Not empty apologies or temporary fixes, but systemic change grounded in respect and fairness. The flight she had missed now became a symbol, not of failure, but of a moment when silence spoke volumes, when a simple video galvanized a nation to look in the mirror. Behind the scenes, conversations intensified among policymakers, advocacy groups, and airline officials. Proposals for revising security protocols, improving staff training on bias, and increasing transparency were drafted. Yet real change would require more than documents. It demanded vigilance from the public and courage from those willing to speak. Meanwhile, on social media, the hashtags kept trending. #Gate28. Justice was no longer just a hashtag, it was a rallying cry. It became a beacon for those who had long felt unheard, a digital space where shared experiences built solidarity. And through it all, AOC remained a quiet force, her strength less about loud declarations and more about unwavering presence. Her story reminded millions that sometimes the most powerful act is standing firm in dignity, even when the world tries to strip it away. The digital world was a floodgate opening, and the comments came rushing in like a tide no one could stem. From every corner of the country, voices began to rise, not as shouts or cries, but as whispers that grew louder with each telling. Teachers writing from small-town classrooms recalled the humiliation of being questioned on flights, their professional badges disregarded in favor of suspicion. Nurses, exhausted and worn from long shifts, described moments when their simple questions about luggage or ID were met with hostility, branded as difficult or aggressive. Elderly passengers shared stories of being pulled aside, searched again and again, their frailty met with impatience instead of compassion. One comment read, "This happened to me too. I didn't have a title or a platform, just a body that didn't fit the mold." Another, "They called my mom aggressive for asking why her bag was being searched. She just wanted to know." As these accounts piled up beneath the viral video, a tapestry of shared experiences unfolded. People found solace in each other's words, relief that they were not alone in the face of silent, systemic injustice. Some comments were sharp with anger. How many more of us have to be ignored or humiliated before this changes? One user typed. This isn't security, it's discrimination disguised as protocol. Others struck a more hopeful tone. Thank you for standing strong, Congresswoman. Your silence is louder than any scream. AOC scrolled through the endless stream, her thumb moving almost automatically, eyes scanning each word. She read the pain and the resilience in equal measure. She saw faces she'd never meet, lives she'd never touch. Yet they were part of this moment now, woven into a narrative bigger than any one of them alone. Her breath hitched once, a single tear escaping down her cheek. Not for herself, but for the collective weight of those unseen stories. For every person who had swallowed their words for fear of being labeled too much. For every mother, daughter, and grandmother made to feel less than human. Her phone screen blurred as she blinked, but she kept reading. Amid the flood of messages, one stood out. From a military veteran who wrote about his father's missed heart surgery due to repeated security concerns at airports. Another from a young woman who shared how she'd been separated from her family on a business trip. Her protest met with cold indifference. Each comment was a fragment of the same broken system, a mirror reflecting the faces of countless victims. In the quiet of her hotel room, surrounded by the soft hum of the city outside, AOC felt the weight settle on her shoulders. It was not the burden of a single injustice, but the collective demand for change. She didn't respond publicly. Not yet. Instead, she crafted a letter, a statement meant not only for the airline or TSA, but for every individual who had ever been made to feel invisible. She wrote, "Dignity isn't a reward, it's a right. It does not require a badge or a platform to be recognized. When the system fails to see us as human, it fails us all." Her words would be published in major newspapers the following days, quoted widely and shared like a beacon in the storm. The ripple effect was undeniable. The comments kept coming, the stories growing, the conversation deepening, and through it all, AOC sat silently, letting the voices speak louder than she ever could. After the flood of messages, the relentless scrutiny, and the hours spent reliving every moment in her mind, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat at her desk late into the night. The soft hum of the city outside her window was a quiet reminder that the world continued spinning, unaware or unwilling to pause for the weight of moments like hers. She opened a fresh document on her laptop and began to type. This was not a press release. It was not a political statement. It was a truth she could no longer keep folded in the confines of her own experience. Her fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, forging words that demanded to be heard. Words meant not just for headlines, but for the hearts of all who had been silenced. Dignity isn't a reward. It's a right. For too long, we've been told that respect is something earned, something given only when convenience allows or when power deems fit. We are conditioned to accept that being treated with dignity depends on how loudly we raise our voices or how prominently our names appear in public records. But that is a lie. Dignity is not conditional. It does not come wrapped in titles or endorsements. It is a fundamental right, one that belongs to every person who walks through an airport terminal, waits in line at a grocery store, or enters a room where history is being made. My own experience at LaGuardia Airport was not unique. It was a reflection of a deeper systemic problem. When I was singled out for additional screening, not because of a legitimate threat, but because of an unseen bias, I was not just denied passage on a flight, I was denied recognition as a human being. The moment they refused to acknowledge my congressional ID, the moment they dismissed my calm questions as difficult, the moment they called security without cause, they were telling me, and millions like me, that we do not belong. They were telling us that our presence is negotiable, that our worth can be questioned by strangers who hold the power to obstruct our movement and, by extension, our voice. But dignity does not fluctuate with circumstance. It does not diminish because someone else's prejudice demands it. Her fingers paused over the keys. She thought of the countless messages she had read, from teachers labeled too emotional, from nurses told to calm down, from elders treated like strangers in places they called home. Their stories were woven into hers, strands in a tapestry of exclusion and endurance. She resumed typing. We cannot wait for recognition. We cannot ask permission to be treated fairly. The burden cannot continue to rest solely on those who endure these indignities. It must shift to systems, to institutions, to individuals entrusted with power. Accountability must be more than a catchphrase. It must be a practice, embedded in every policy, every interaction, every moment where we choose how to treat one another. I was offered vouchers and upgrades after the incident. They were generous gestures, perhaps well-intended, but no compensation can undo the message sent by a stranger's smirk, by the cold dismissal of credentials, by the silent judgment that followed me through sterile hallways. What I need, what we all need, is consistency. Not courtesy granted only when convenient, but a guarantee that dignity will be afforded to every person, every time. She looked out the window. The city lights flickered like distant stars, indifferent yet constant. Her fingers typed the final lines. Don't offer me courtesy. Offer me consistency. It is time for us to demand more than temporary apologies. It is time for us to rebuild the systems that fail us, to teach respect as a rule, not an exception, to recognize that justice is not a performance, but a responsibility. This letter was sent to several major newspapers, published the next morning with a headline that echoed through the country. Dignity is a right, not a reward. AOC's call for accountability. In the days that followed, the line resonated beyond print. It was shared, repeated, and embraced by those who knew too well the sting of being overlooked. The letter was more than words. It was a movement, a call to action, a mirror held up to a society that often chooses convenience over courage, indifference over integrity, and at its heart, a reminder that standing still, with quiet strength, can speak louder than any shout. The glare of cameras and the hum of microphones awaited her at every turn. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was not there to perform. Reporters pressed for interviews, eager to capture her voice, her reaction, her story, but she held firm. I don't want to be a story, she told her team quietly but clearly, the words carrying a weight far beyond the room. I want the system to change. Her decision rippled through the media world like a shockwave. While many would have leapt at the chance for the spotlight, for the viral moment, AOC chose silence, not out of retreat, but out of purpose. She knew the power of narrative, the way a story can capture attention, but also how easily it can be distorted, reduced, or forgotten. Being the headline could turn her pain into spectacle, her experience into entertainment. That was not what she sought. Instead, she wanted the real work, the slow, grinding, often invisible process of reforming policies, challenging institutional biases, and rebuilding trust in systems that had long failed people like her and countless others. Her refusal was not a withdrawal, it was a strategic stand, a declaration that the fight was not about her. It was about the countless people without a platform, whose voices were muffled daily by procedures dressed as protocols. Meetings replaced interviews. Policy drafts replaced sound bites. Conversations with lawmakers and advocates took precedence over red carpets and flashing bulbs. To her closest aides, she was both relentless and patient. The media frenzy was a moment. The change was a mission. In quiet moments, she reflected on the flood of stories she'd seen. The teachers, the nurses, the elderly, the working parents who'd shared their pain online. They weren't looking for headlines. They were looking for justice. And that was the spotlight she aimed to shine. The early afternoon sun filtered softly through the tall windows of the congressional office building, casting long, pale beams onto the worn wooden floors. In a small, quiet corner, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat on a bench just outside a meeting room, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her gaze distant yet focused. Beside her, a young intern named Talia, a wide-eyed, earnest 19-year-old from Kansas, watched her with a mixture of admiration and awe. They had just finished a discussion on civil rights policy, but the conversation that had left the deepest mark was not about legislation or speeches. It was about what had happened weeks ago, at the airport, under the harsh fluorescent lights, in the watchful eyes of strangers. You didn't say much, Talia whispered, voice tinged with disbelief. But you made it loud. Alexandria turned to her slowly, a small knowing smile touching her lips. She studied the girl's face, the innocence, the hunger for understanding, the hope, and nodded. Sometimes, she said softly, the loudest thing you can say is silence. Talia frowned, trying to wrap her mind around the paradox. But how? How can silence be louder than words? AOC's eyes glistened as she leaned back, her thoughts drifting to that cold terminal, to the moment when she was led aside, not with raised voices or protests, but with quiet dignity. It's about presence, AOC explained, about standing your ground without needing to shout, about holding space for the truth to be seen and felt, without letting anger or fear drown it out. She thought of the faces in the crowd, the passengers who watched, the strangers who whispered, the phones that recorded every moment. None of them saw a spectacle. They saw a woman who refused to be diminished, a woman whose stillness was a challenge. Sometimes, she continued, people expect a fight. They want noise, confrontation, but that's not always where the real power lies. Talia nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the words. I guess it's easier to ignore shouting, but when someone stands quietly, it forces you to pay attention. That's exactly it, AOC said. Silence forces reflection. It unsettles those who depend on chaos to mask their biases. It makes space for people to confront their own discomfort and maybe, just maybe, begin to change. The intern's eyes sparkled with newfound understanding. I never thought about it like that. I always thought you had to be loud to be heard. Alexandria smiled warmly. Being heard isn't about volume. It's about clarity and truth. Sometimes the most important statements don't need sound. They need courage. They sat together on the bench for a moment longer, the city humming softly beyond the windows, a place of power and paradox, where voices rose and fell like tides. In that quiet space, AOC felt the invisible threads that connected her story with those of millions who had felt unseen and unheard. Her fight was not just her own, it was theirs too. And sometimes the loudest roar is the one carried in the silence of a single moment. The evening settled quietly over their home in Fort Worth, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls, lined with books and framed memories. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sank into the worn leather chair by the window. Exhaustion and resolve intertwined in her expression. Robert Salazar sat opposite her, his presence steady like a rock in the shifting tides of their lives. He studied her for a moment, eyes calm but searching. They saw your silence, he said quietly, and only then did they finally listen. Alexandria nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling deep into her bones. Not because of my voice, she replied, her voice soft but sure, because they couldn't ignore their own reflection. The room was still for a heartbeat. Then Robert leaned forward, his fingers interlaced, voice warm yet resolute. It's easy to mistake silence for submission, he said, but you showed them it can be something far more powerful, a mirror held up to their own conscience. When they looked at you, standing calm, unyielding, they couldn't look away from themselves. Alexandria's gaze drifted to the window, where the city lights flickered against the dark sky. That moment in the airport, she began, when I was pulled aside, I could have shouted, I could have fought, but I chose not to, because sometimes fighting only feeds the noise, and noise often drowns out truth. Robert nodded, and truth has a way of piercing through noise when it's steady, unwavering. She glanced back at him, eyes reflecting a mix of fatigue and fierce determination. The silence wasn't absence, it was presence. It was a stand. It was a refusal to be broken down by a system that wanted to erase me. He smiled gently. And that's why they listen. Not to the words you spoke, but to the stillness that demanded respect. Alexandria exhaled deeply. But it's not just about me. It never was. It's about everyone who's been made invisible. Everyone who's been made to feel less than, simply because of who they are or where they come from. Robert's eyes softened. You gave them a chance to see that, without shouting, without spectacle. You let your dignity speak. She looked away, fingers tracing the worn armrest. Sometimes I wonder if that's enough. If quiet strength is enough to change things that have been broken for so long. Robert reached across and squeezed her hand. It is, because change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers first, and when it gathers enough whispers, it becomes a roar no one can ignore. For a moment, they sat together in silence, the kind that isn't emptiness, but understanding. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm, unaware of the battles fought in quiet rooms like this one. Alexandria broke the silence. We have to keep holding up that mirror, not just for those who see it now, but for those who will one day stand where I stand. Robert smiled, pride shining in his eyes. And when they do, they'll know they're not alone. The room seemed to breathe with the weight of promise, of futures shaped not by anger alone, but by the power of steady, unwavering presence. What began as a single moment, one congresswoman quietly stopped and searched, soon became a ripple that grew into a wave. Stories poured in from across the country, flooding social media feeds and inboxes. They came from teachers, nurses, veterans, grandparents, everyday travelers who had faced similar moments of invisible judgment and silent dismissal. The voices were varied, but the message was clear. This wasn't just AOC's experience. It was theirs too. In quiet offices away from the cameras, TSA leadership took notice. Internal meetings were called. Training modules were revised, not with fanfare, but with the sober understanding that something fundamental had to change. It wasn't just about safety protocols anymore. It was about dignity, respect, and recognizing the humanity in every traveler. Airline executives, initially hesitant, began drafting statements of accountability. The public apology was issued, this time naming Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez directly. It was brief, cautious, and carefully worded, but the acknowledgement itself marked a shift. We regret the incident involving Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and are conducting a full review of our procedures to ensure every passenger is treated with respect and professionalism, the statement read. For some it was a start, for others it was overdue. The public's response was swift and vocal. The hashtags continued trending. Advocates demanded transparency. Lawmakers called for hearings. And the people who had shared their stories found solace in collective recognition. Yet behind the headlines and statements lay the deeper, quieter truth. Real change would require more than words. It would require commitment, hard, sustained work to dismantle systemic bias and rebuild trust. AOC watched this unfolding from afar, aware that her story had become a mirror for many, but also a call to action. Each message, each conversation, each shared experience reinforced a simple yet profound truth. No one should have to prove their worthiness for dignity. From one story, many others had found their voice, and together those voices began to reshape the narrative. Months had passed since that tense morning when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was pulled aside at Gate 28. Now she found herself back at LaGuardia, walking with a quiet purpose. The airport was busier, the hum louder, but the memories of that day still lingered in the air like a distant echo. She approached the familiar gate, the one where the confrontation had unfolded. This time, the faces behind the counter were different, calmer, more attentive. The staff greeted her with nods, subtle but sincere, as if the lesson of that day had settled into their routine. AOC's steps were steady. No hurried glances, no defensive posture, just the grace of someone who had reclaimed her space. As she reached the waiting area, a small hand tugged gently at her coat. She turned to see a little girl, no older than 7, eyes bright with curiosity and awe. "I saw you on TV," the child said shyly, offering a tentative smile. AOC knelt down to meet her gaze, warmth spreading across her face. "I'm glad you did," she said softly. "Did it make you feel brave?" The girl nodded, cheeks flushing. "Yes, you didn't yell, but you made everyone listen." The moment was fleeting but profound. Around them, passengers glanced their way, some smiling, some wiping tears quietly. It was as if the story had become more than a headline. It was now a shared memory, a symbol of resilience. The boarding call came, soft and unobtrusive. AOC stood and exchanged a brief wave with the little girl, who waved back with the enthusiasm of someone who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Walking toward the jet bridge, AOC's mind reflected on the journey, from that cold, sterile corridor to this quiet victory of acknowledgement. The staff scanned her boarding pass with respect, no questions asked. The TSA officers were courteous, professional. The air felt different, lighter, more just. She found her seat by the window and looked out at the planes taxiing under the morning sun. The city below buzzed with life, unaware of the quiet battles waged in its shadows. A voiceover filled the space as the plane prepared for takeoff. What happens when you're treated like you don't belong and you don't shout back? You show them how wrong they were simply by standing your ground. The screen faded to black, the title appearing boldly. The Gate That Judged. Too soon the terminal buzzed softly around her. The steady footsteps of travelers, the distant announcements echoing through the cavernous space, the shuffle of bags and soft murmurs of conversations blending into a familiar background hum. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez moved through it all with calm certainty, her strides purposeful yet unassuming. Each step carried the weight of what had transpired, yet also the quiet strength of someone who refused to be diminished. As she approached the gate, the familiar sight of the boarding area welcomed her. But something had changed. The air felt different, not just because of the passing time, but because of the collective consciousness that had shifted in the wake of her story. The subtle nods from staff, the respectful glances, the absence of hesitation. It was all testament to a hard-fought transformation, born from courage and unwavering dignity. Her gaze lifted toward the boarding bridge, the threshold between one chapter and the next. And as her feet carried her closer to the waiting plane, a voice, a soft, steady narration, began to fill the space, weaving a final message that lingered long after the last word. What happens when you're treated like you don't belong and you don't shout back? The voice began, rich with quiet conviction. You show them how wrong they were simply by standing your ground. Alexandria's footsteps slowed as the voice wrapped around the room like a gentle tide. She paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the railing, eyes reflecting the journey, both the struggle and the triumph. It wasn't the loud protests or fiery speeches that changed the course of the story. It was the steadfastness in the face of dismissal, the refusal to let indignity define her, the power held in stillness. Her silence wasn't absence, it was presence. A presence so profound that it demanded acknowledgement not just of her, but of every person who had ever been made to feel invisible. Around her, travelers continued their routines, unaware of the ripples beneath the surface. The countless lives touched, the conversations sparked, the barriers challenged. But for those who watched, for those who listened, the message was clear. Dignity is not a privilege to be granted. It is a right to be recognized. As the boarding call came over the loudspeaker, the voiceover continued, weaving hope and resilience into its cadence. In a world quick to judge, slow to listen, it takes more than noise to be heard. It takes courage, the courage to stand, to be still, and to believe that your worth is not measured by the volume of your voice, but by the strength of your conviction. Alexandria turned toward the entrance of the plane, pausing briefly to meet the eyes of a small child waving enthusiastically from the waiting area. A reminder that stories, no matter how heavy, carry seeds of hope for generations to come. With a final breath, she stepped forward, crossing the threshold with grace. The screen faded to black, leaving only the words, "The Gate That Judged Too Soon," a testament not just to one woman's journey, but to the enduring fight for respect, justice, and humanity in every corner of the world.